You give me a time and a place, I give you a 5 minute window. Anything happens in that 5 minutes, I'm yours, no matter what. Anything happens a minute either side of that, and you're on your own. Drive is coming up next on Rediscovered Movies. Hello, my name is Nomfanelo Malloy. I am your host of Rediscovered Movies, where overlooked movies, whether mainstream, independent, or somewhere in between, are discussed to be rediscovered for your viewing pleasure. Drive is a crime drama directed by Nicholas Winding Refn, who's known for the Pusher films, Bronson, The Neon Demon, and Only God Forgives. This movie is based off a book of the same name by James Solis. The cast is a good one. It includes Ryan Gosling, Carey Mulligan, Bryan Cranston, Christina Hendricks, Ron Perlman, Oscar Isaac, and Albert Brooks. Here is the synopsis. Driver is a skilled Hollywood stuntman who moonlights as a getaway driver for criminals. Though he projects an icy exterior, lately he's been warming up to a pretty neighbor named Irene and her young son Benicio. When Irene's husband gets out of jail, he enlists Driver's help in the $1 million heist. The job goes horribly wrong, and Driver must risk his life to protect Irene and Benicio from the vengeful masterminds behind the robbery. One of the reasons why I chose this movie for the premiere is that it is celebrating its 10-year anniversary as it came out back in 2011. In terms of reception, critics, according to Rotten Tomatoes, gave this movie 93%. Here's what the critics had to say. With its hyper-stylized blend of violence, music, and striking imagery, Drive represents a fully realized vision of art house action. So, clearly, critics were entertained with this film. What did the audience think? Well, they gave it, on Rotten Tomatoes, 79%. And with a C- cinema score. So, audience, you could say they were like okay about it, but it was certainly different from what they imagined the film to be. Because when the trailer for this movie came out, many, I would say, hoped or actually predicted that, oh, this movie is like Fast and Furious. Because obviously the trailer shows sizzle reel of Ryan Gosling in the driver's seat, driving around fast-paced. But obviously when the movie came out, it wasn't like that. So, it came out on theaters September 16th. In North America, it debuted number 3 with 11.3 million. Guess which movie beated this movie at the box office during opening weekend? Well, it was the re-release of The Lion King in 3D, which made 30.1 million, which is mind-blowing. I mean, it's rare for a release film to do well at the box office, let alone open to number 1. But I guess, it was something that kids, I guess, could enjoy. But I mean, at the same time, you could have seen this movie at home. And plus, I imagine with the 3D, because if you guys remember, Avatar came out 2009 in 3D, which blew people away. It has, good 3D. I've seen it in the theaters. I could attest to that. But because that movie did crazy well, you saw tons of movies released in 3D. Some, I would say, lived up to those expectations, while others, I would say the majority, failed. So, just back to the box office. So, Contagion was number 2 during opening weekend with 14.5 million. I would say solid movie. Go check that out. So Drive, it made a grand total of 76.9 million during its theatrical run. So 35.06 was domestic, with 41.9 million international. This movie is available on Amazon Prime to stream and video on demand. Check your local listings. Okay, now I am going to share my thoughts on the movie. So I'm going to start off with a segment called First Discoveries. With this category, I essentially talk about how I first learned about this movie, what were my initial reactions when I first saw it, and has that opinion changed since then. So, how I first learned about it was when it had its debut at the Cannes Film Festival back in 2011. I heard that it got standing ovation from audience members, and Nicholas Winding Refn, he won a Best Director's award. I was not familiar with his work at the time, but from what I researched, he did mainly, I guess you could say, art house or experimental type movies, mainly overseas. And I thought, it sounds, with this movie, it kind of sounds like a 70s, crime film, with Steve McQueen or, Clint Eastwood, that era type movies, but modern. And once I saw, a bit more, footage, when it premiered at San Diego Comic-Con and Toronto Film Festival, I was intrigued. The trailers, obviously I was interested in the movie, but I wasn't really too sure about the trailers at the time because it kind of seemed to suggest that this movie was an action movie. I mean, yes, it does have action, but I would say it's more like a thriller because with its, moments that kind of keep you on the edge of your seat. So, when it came out in theaters, I saw it opening weekend. With the theater where I was at, there wasn't too many people. I would say it was empty, but I mean, there was still quite enough people. And after I finished watching the theater, my mind was blown. I'll break my thoughts in the next category, but essentially it immediately became one of my favorite movies of 2011. And it was really an interesting, I guess, career move for Ryan Gosling at that point because he had 3 slates of movies that year after he did a hiatus. So the other 2 that came out that year was The Ides of March and Crazy Stupid Love. Drive obviously is my favorite out of the 3 because it really, he kind of gives a different performance in that movie. A more, I wouldn't say laid back, but he's kind of reserved, but he certainly has a presence. And obviously since the film's released many years later, I still enjoy that movie. So really my opinion hasn't changed since I first saw it. I'm going to break down my thoughts on the film in this segment I call Highlights and Lowlights. Let's start off with the highlights. Essentially what worked. Los Angeles. It's admirable that here, Los Angeles, it's really less attractive because we see Los Angeles mainly at night. There's a lot of night scenes. And during the day, like, we see, like, there's not a lot of, like, touristry type attractions. Because essentially, like, we follow Driver, like, when he's on the road, and him at his apartment, and then him at work at the garage, and kind of like the lesser populated areas of Los Angeles. I thought, wow, this really like worked for this movie since it's a crime drama. You don't want to be showing a lot of, I would say, touristry attractions because that could distract the viewer from the movie. Because I like how Los Angeles is very dark and gritty. I would say, like, there is the scene where Driver and Irene, uh, during the montage, where they are driving down that famous tunnel, which is shown in tons of films and TV. But really, apart from that, we don't see too many notable landmarks from Los Angeles, which worked. This soundtrack is a banger. Loved the sort of the dark EDM feel to it. Since this movie is independent, like, it fits, of course, the director's wheelhouse, like with his previous movies. So, of course, fitting to, like, I guess, with the director's vision, we don't really get notable, at least famous, I guess, singers or artists to contribute to the soundtrack. Because prior to this movie, I did not know Kavinsky or the Chromatics, none of them. But after, like, this movie, it kind of, like, piqued my interest to kind of learn more about the artist's work. The use of silence in this movie, it could have been, like, a hit and miss, but here, like, it worked. Because since Driver, he is, like, the silent type. He doesn't have a name. We just know him as Driver. So really, like, there's a lot of non-verbal communication, but when he talks, like, it's critical. With the scenes, particularly with Driver and Irene, I mean, those are really eye-catching because we see that clearly, like, they like each other, and it is mind-blowing. I'm speechless. But yeah, like, I guess they have, like, their own, like, inner, like, monologue that they're communicating to each other that as the audience may not be clued in, but we can kind of get, like, the vibe on what those characters are projecting. And it's also, yeah, noted that apparently Ryan Gosling and Nicholas Winding Refn, apparently they trimmed down a lot of the dialogue that was in the earlier drafts of the movie in order to, I guess, use more subtext, more nonverbal communication, which is admirable. Because I bet that if it was another director, essentially with the dialogue, I believe that was in the book, it would have been really used more. And if it was a major studio, obviously, like, you'll hear tons of dialogue, which could either work or not. Now, the jacket. That scorpion jacket is fire. When I first saw that jacket, it looked really cool with the satin lining and the scorpion on the back of his jacket. I recall that people they wanted that jacket and I was one of them. It was hard. It was hard to find like where that jacket was sold, but I would love like a customized jacket. Now for scenes, I would say yeah, like the whole movie, excellent. But some scenes that I particularly enjoyed, the opening sequence with Driver at his apartment. He is talking to the criminals on the phone in terms of how the situation is going to go down. Then he does a job, and then we cut to opening credits. Interesting choice with the credits using hot neon pink with cursive fonts. That is really like an interesting stylistic choice, but it works for this movie. And having night call in the background, it kind of gives you that feel to it. That oh, this is going to be like a cool movie that we are going along for the ride. The strip club scene where Driver like he goes after Cook after he almost gets killed. Engaging because we see him talk to one of the strippers to ask like where Cook is. And then once he walks down that hallway, once that hammer drops, it I was like, whoa. I was like, this is about to go down. And once he finds Cook in the dressing room, like, it's just madness. When Driver takes a bullet and then places it on Cook's forehead, we see Driver like he is about to lose his stuff. I mean, he kind of pauses like after he talks to Nino like on the phone, but yeah, like it could have gone either way. But yeah, clearly at that point, like Driver, like he has kind of lost his cool. Because prior, like we see Driver, like he's kind of like too cool for school, but he'd rather be in the background, especially like with his job as a stuntman, because we pretty much see him wear this freaky VFX mask as he does his stunts. And he really is the type of character that doesn't want to like stand out, but once like he is there in the scene, like we could certainly feel his presence. And with the strip club scene, like his presence is noted. The elevator scene when he stomps, holy moly. It really was interesting. I've never seen like a scene happen like that way prior to this movie, but yeah, we can certainly like kind of feel like every like kick that he delivers to this assailant. And Carey Mulligan, like she is just in shock because prior to him, beating the guy up, they share a moment. They have a kiss in slow motion. And then Driver, like, immediately goes to town on this guy. And then, like, Driver, like, he is I would say like embarrassed because he had to do that in front of Irene, and she is just like speechless at the point. But we don't really get to see her react because the elevator door is closed as she exits. Iconic scene. Nino's death scene. That really felt like a horror movie because we see Driver in that freakish mask. He kind of like stalks Nino, like who's kind of having a good time at his pizzeria. And once like Nino, like he's in the car, we see Driver's kind of like taunting with him, like with the lights. But then once those headlights turn on, we know it's about to go down. And then once he rammers that car off the cliff, that that score, intense score, it kind of like keeps your heart beating, but we as the audience kind of know like what's going to happen with this character. And I want to say the performances from the cast solid, particularly from Ryan Gosling and Albert Brooks. Because really here, like, it's really a different type of performance for Albert Brooks. Because I have not seen too many of his previous work. I just know him for being Nemo's dad in Finding Nemo, but because he's really known for doing lots of comedies, and I say like solid job he gave, playing this mobster figure who really has a maternal side, like when he interacts with Driver. I thought solid. So really, like this movie is filled with highlights, whether it's those scenes of like Driver like on the road, or him like beaten up or evading assailants, particularly like after the car chase sequence. I thought, wow. I don't have really anything to add in terms of the lowlights of the movie, but what I would say is that with the trailer, I believe the theatrical trailer, when that came out, it kind of was misleading because, like I said earlier, like it kind of suggested that this movie was an action, even though it does have those moments. It's not. It's like a thriller, a crime thriller. Yeah, I just wished maybe like the trailer could show more of, I don't know, like Driver of like psychosis, like how he is dealing with things, like when like he meets Irene, or stuff what happens after Irene's husband gets killed, that sort of stuff. But also, like, I want to note that in terms of the violence, I didn't mind it, but I could see why some people could be turned off about it because at times it could get pretty graphic, particularly with the scene at the motel when Blanche she gets her head shut off. Like it's really shown in detail in slow motion, and when Driver like he kills the assailants that enter, that was pretty intense. So I felt like the violence in this movie, like it wasn't like exploitive in the sense that it was just there for the sake of violence. Like it was kind of like showing like like the chaos like of the situations and how the characters react in order to get out of that situation. Now, I would like to share some trivia with you. So, pretty much talk about any fun facts about the film. This movie has quite a lot. So, let's start at the beginning. So, as I mentioned, this movie is based off a book of the same name, which was released in 2005. So apparently, the producers, Mark Platt and Adam Siegel, they optioned the novel after Siegel read a review from Publishers Weekly. Because apparently, he felt the driver was, quote, the kind of character you rarely see anymore. He was a man with a purpose. He was a very good at one thing and made no apologies for it. That really was interesting because with I guess with the book, I guess what reminded the producers of those like movies like from the 70s were with the leading men like Steve McQueen, Clint Eastwood, were essentially they're kind of like too cool for school. We don't know much about their backstory, but we know that they're essentially badasses. And it's kind of like refreshing to see like movies like that because really it kind of puts you along for the ride. So really like as an audience like you kind of just focus more on the situation, what's going down without revealing like too much about the character's backstory, which either may or may not be crucial to the plot. So, after the producers optioned the rights for the novel, it was announced in 2008 that Neil Marshall was going to direct a film with Hugh Jackman to star under Universal Pictures. But that fell through by February 2010. And Platt, he decided to contact Ryan Gosling to star in the movie. I mean, that if that version of the movie if it went through, it would have been very different from what we got with the final product. Because I would imagine, because the book has a lot of dialogue, that with that version, I imagine it was going to be similar to what happened in the book. And really, with Nicholas Winding Refn, like, of course, he wanted to keep the essence of the book in terms, I guess, of the plot, but really, like, he wanted to make it more like character driven without revealing too much characters, if that makes sense. So, after when Ryan Gosling like he signed on to do the film, he approached Nicholas Winding Refn to direct the film because he was a fan of his previous work. So apparently, like when they met, Nicholas Winding Refn, like he apparently was ill, and he wanted, I guess, a ride home after their meeting. And apparently, a song by Radio Speedwagon came on, and that's when Refn he kind of pitched his idea for the movie, and then the rest was history. So after Nicholas Winding Refn, after when he signed on, he moved into an LA home during filming and insisted that the cast members and the writer move in with him so they could essentially workshop the movie. They would work on the script, they would watch movies, they would edit or drive at night. And apparently he requested that the editing suite be placed in his home as well. And with a shooting script of 81 pages. The director and Gosling, they continued to trim down the dialogue during filming. That is really kind of rare for a production to go down like that, because it kind of reminded me of theater. Because theater essentially, like, everyone from cast to designers, directors, so forth, we're all kind of in the same, like, bubble. Like, we're all there essentially to make a good production. So I don't know, like, if the director has a theater background, but really he wanted to create a sense of community where essentially everybody is there to contribute despite what role they're in. And that's really admirable. And obviously you could tell that all the elements came together. You saw, like, pretty much the cast had tons of chemistry. And I guess living in the same place, it worked out. Another fun fact, with with Nicholas Winding Refn's visual style apparently consistent, he used wide angle lenses, which were used by cinematographer Newton Thomas Sigel. They avoided handheld camera work, thank God, because they wanted to keep the film more grounded and authentic, and avoided CGI, mainly because it was too expensive. Kudos. And apparently, with the director's inspiration came partly from reading Grimm's fairy tales, and his goal was to make, quote, a fairy tale that takes Los Angeles as a background, with the driver as a hero. And to play with the common theme of fairy tales, the driver protects what is good, while at the same time killing degenerate people in violent ways. Interesting. So I guess, yeah, in a way, you could say this movie is like a fable, where our protagonist, driver, he kind of has to go through a series of trials to make it out at the end of the day, or end of the night in this case. And for the music, the director, he wanted a score by Johnny Jewel of Desire and Chromatics, whose music was used in the movie. But apparently the studio, they had other plans. They instead hired Cliff Martinez at the last minute to imitate the style and feel of Jewel's bands, Chromatics and Glass Candy. I thought interesting. I mean, it was kind of disappointed that's how it went down. But I mean, at the same time, when I was listening to the score, I felt, there was a cohesion in terms of the tone and the feel of both the score and the soundtrack. Now, continuing on with the soundtrack. So, the director, going through Johnny Jewel's catalog. He picked out Under Your Spell and Tick of the Clock, because he thought of the film being a fairy tale. At first, Jewel worried that Under Your Spell might be too literal, but soon realized it's used in Drive, quote, in the exact same way that I was feeling it when I wrote it. He definitely got the nuance of the song and understood what it was supposed to mean, and he wanted to give that emotion to the viewer, that same feeling. I was not familiar with his previous work, but with those song selections, it worked. Because even I remember with Tick of the Clock, tongue twister there. That was used in numerous films, including one of the sequels for Taken. I think it was Taken 2. And I just want to mention that the studio Film District, back in November 2010, they acquired the North American distribution rights. This was after their project on Universal fell through. So apparently they were so eager to get their hands on Drive, they started negotiating to buy it before seeing any footage, believing it could appeal to people who enjoy a genre movie as well as art house crowd. I mean, kudos to that studio. I mean, it's kind of unfortunate that that company disbanded, but certainly this movie was notable amongst their catalog. Now I'll wrap up with this question. Why should this movie be rediscovered? Well, for one, Los Angeles. Dark take on the LA city that doesn't focus on those trying to make it big, being celebrity and famous, that sort of stuff. Soundtrack, banger, loved the music choices with Jules' catalog, a real hero, tick of the clock, bangers. Subtext, love how it was minimalist. I loved the dialogue was not literal. It wasn't in your face. So really, here it kind of gives the audience to kind of like guess like what is happening without being spoon-fed. So certainly with this movie, it doesn't underestimate the audience. Nicholas Winding Refn, amazing job with the visual style. Again, I was not familiar with his previous work, but after seeing this movie, it kind of made me curious to see his work that he has done previously and since this movie. Ryan Gosling, MVP of this movie, not just in terms of his performance, but also him recruiting the director. Because had this version fell through, probably this movie would not have the acclaim that this movie has currently. So I really urge you, if you haven't seen the movie, please check it out. It's available to stream on Amazon Prime, and it's available on demand, so check your local listings. That is a wrap on this episode of the podcast. You can submit questions, comments, and suggestions by email, which is rediscoveredmovies@gmail.com. Those will be read along with a recap of the season, which will air after the season finale. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at @RDMoviesPod for updates. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.